Wonderful.
Very good.
Gotten that on the recording so everyone can see that I'm very friendly.
All right, take two.
I'm gonna repeat that one more time just so we can get on the recording. How is everybody today? Okay. That's better. That's much better. Besides me, has anyone here really read this CLP form in detail? I've had to read it over multiple times. I just, will admit that to you. So ideally, I won't make any mistakes in regards to today's discussion.
Let's see. Can you guys hear us at home?
Yes, we do.
Okay. Thank you.
First,
I like Carmenza.
That was summer.
Oh, that's something. Okay. Notice interest rates haven't gone down. Anybody whining about that? Buyers, are they complaining about that?
always,
What was that?
always complaining.
Always complaining, yeah. Yeah, it's difficult right now. There's no question about that.
What's interest rate right now?
What are interest rates right now? I'm guessing around, someone correct me, 6.25%, 6.5% approximately.
6.25%?
Yeah,
Okay,
Something.
lovely.
something like that. But I would suggest that if I'm a buyer,
Yeah.
I would be looking at something like a 5-year fixed program. Rates are substantially lower, probably at least 1 percentage point lower, I would say. 5 years is a long time. Ideally, between now and 5 years, we would see rates coming down. We don't know. There's never any guarantee. Anything you do, you keep for, but that could save somebody $500 to $1,000 a month. Did I miss something?
Yeah, can you
No, that's okay.
turn the volume down on that? Thank you.
Okay. I put my hand up, Carlos.
It's gonna lock in on you now.
Okay, it's locked in. It's lying. It's not locking in on me.
It has to blink. Hold it up.
I'm waving to you, James. I'm doing this right. I can
I think you just have to put it next to you up here.
next to me.
There you go.
Okay, it's blinking. Okay. Good morning, everybody. So today's discussion, we're going to go over in detail, in depth, the CLP form, contingency for the sale of a buyer's property. It sounds so simple, doesn't it? I'm going to make an offer and I'm going to make my purchase of your home contingent upon the sale of my existing home. But the form that we're going to review is very awkward. Let's put it that way. It's only 2 pages, but the referrals in between, all the details, it becomes very, very confusing. So I thought we would go through this initially and some other aspects in regards to contingency removal. So let's start from the very beginning. This is an addendum to the purchase agreement, right? That's the default language. You can use this in regards to other aspects. So on the 3rd line down, it says on property known as 12 Longview property. So that is the property that the buyer is attempting to acquire. And it's saying the buyer's name is Richard Moore, and the seller is, in our case, the Fusola Trust. And the buyer's property, where the buyer is living currently, is 3500 Barranca Parkway. So this is just part of our example. Let's go down to section 1, buyer's property contingency. The agreement is contingent upon, and we have 3 choices. The default choice is section 1A, buyer entering into a contract for the sale of and closing escrow on buyer's property. And the buyer's property in this case is 3500 Barranca Parkway. So the default contingency is predicated upon the buyer entering into a contract for the sale of their existing primary residence and closing escrow. Closing escrow is a long period of time. The next opportunity or choice would be section 1B, only entering into a contract for the sale of buyer's property. So if I'm a buyer and I make an offer on 12 Longview in Coto de Caza, and I check section 1B, the contingency I have is only predicated upon me selling my property, in this example, located at 3500 Barranca Parkway. Selling, not closing. So it's very risky for a buyer, whereas Section 1B is predicated upon the buyer not only entering into a contract for the sale of their property, but also closing escrow. Unless escrow closes, the buyer most likely is going to have insufficient funds to close the transaction to acquire the property located at 12 Longview. So this is important just because you are representing the buyer, but also if you're the listing agent, this is very critical. Actually, for the listing agent, I would say that this is even more critical when entertaining an offer that is contingent upon the sale of the buyer's property. So the next contingency is Section 1C, and it's only contingent upon the close of escrow of buyer's property. And if the property is in escrow, we would want the buyer to specify the name of the escrow company. In this case, it's Sterling Escrow. And the sale of the buyer's property is scheduled to close October 23rd. And it's just an arbitrary date. Now, when the buyer's submitting an offer, if you're representing a buyer and you're submitting an offer to the seller, assuming it's in escrow, you have two choices. You should be submitting a copy of the contract for the sale of the buyer's property. The listing agent and or seller is entitled to that. Or in the event you don't submit a copy of that purchase contract for the sale of the buyer's property, you would check the box and it will be delivered within 2 days after acceptance. So I'm a buyer. I made an offer on your listing. I'm claiming it's in escrow. If I want to make my offer really acceptable to a seller, I'm going to submit a copy of the purchase contract with the offer. So the seller knows that indeed I'm in escrow. And then if you don't, within 2 days after acceptance, in this case on 12 Longview, I must submit a copy of that purchase contract and escrow evidence to this seller to give evidence that my property is in escrow. So there's the choices. Section 1A, the contingency is for both the sale or entering into a contract for the sale of my property and closing escrow. Section 1B is simply to enter into a contract for the sale of my existing primary residence. You want to say primary residence. And then Section 1C is simply predicated upon the close of escrow, because I'm claiming I have already entered into a contract to sell my property. Does that sound clear? Any questions about that before we continue?
I had a question about the first section.
Uh-huh.
I have a situation where my buyer, his contingency would be his parents' place selling because he's moving them in. Would this work for something like that?
Absolutely. I don't think it's any different whether it's the buyer's property, but does he need the proceeds from the sale of his parents'
That would
residence?
be like that.
Yeah, so I don't think it's any different, as a matter of fact. It may be a little more awkward.
Yeah.
Knowing it's not his
In an already
property.
awkward form.
But then, Sam, you always lead the way in regards to odd transactions. So I would say, is the buyer getting a loan?
Yes.
All right.
So he's already pre-approved.
He's pre-approved, so there's probably an indication that there are gift funds required. So if I'm a seller, I may scrutinize that a little bit more, obviously. But I would say it's no different than what we've talked about. So is the property in escrow currently?
No,
It's not.
I'm not getting any.
Is it listed?
Yeah.
Is it listed? All right, so that's good news, right? So at least it's listed. We would provide that information. But you can make actually what I would suggest, if I'm submitting an offer in your example, I would check or leave the default response of 1A.
Yeah.
For both the sale of the property and the close of escrow of the buyer's property. In your case, it's going to be someone else's property, so that's a little unusual, I will say. So let's get
Question for the 1C.
1C.
So
Yeah.
if the buyer, I'm presenting the seller. So if the buyer submit this community, this one, but they said, let's say the close escrow date is a certain date on the contract. But later on, they came to me and said, oh, there's something going on, the buyer, the loan has a problem, we're gonna close way later than that. As a seller, what we can do about that?
The agent representing the buyer has an obligation to keep you updated in regards to what's taking place with the transaction itself.
But if the closing date,
Has it been extended? Let's assume it goes to 12/1, for example.
Mhm.
Is that the question possibly? They have an obligation to provide the documentation to keep you apprised of what's taking place. In the event that changes, it opens up an opportunity for the seller to terminate the contract after giving a notice to perform.
okay, so as a seller, we can give them a notice to perform, and then we can cancel it.
You can cancel it. Yes, that's correct. That's
Okay.
correct. So that's a good question. I think that just gets back to my original opening statement. This is just saying I'm making an offer based upon the contingency for the sale of my property. There's a lot of moving parts associated with it, and that's just one of the many aspects that can come up. Because nothing ever happens as we plan. All right. So your escrow goes from 10/23 to 12/1, for example, possibly. So that very well could cause the seller to rethink it and may give them an opportunity to cancel the transaction.
And also, because a lot of times, normally as a seller, they don't want to offer with a contingent on selling. But normally the agent always tell you, hey, we already removed all the contingencies. As a listing agent, can we ask them for the contingency removal?
Yes, you can. You're entitled to ask for that documentation. As a matter of fact, I would say that you're obligated to do that. If you're not following up in regards to the details associated with this Form COP, then you're remiss in regards to performing your professional obligations. So yeah, you should be following up, making sure that you have documentation indicating that the contingencies have been removed. Because first of all, you're going to be entitled to a copy of the purchase contract. So you're going to be able to track the contingency dates, correct? You're entitled to ask for that documentation to show that the buyer has removed their contingencies. And if they haven't, that can open up the opportunity for the seller to cancel the transaction. Not that we want to, but let's at least be aware of what's taking place. We should be questioning what's taking place if contingencies haven't been removed, for example. Otherwise, it could very well cause your sale or your listing to fail. It won't close as agreed. Okay. Any other questions before we continue? So next, Section 2, buyer entering into contract for sale of buyer's property. If 1A or 1B applies, what is 1A? The contingency is for both the sale of my property, entering into a contract for sale of my property and the close of escrow. And 1B is simply for just entering into a contract for the sale of my property. So Section 2, once again, if 1A or 1B applies, the buyer shall have 17 days after acceptance to enter into a contract for the sale of buyer's property. So 1A, once again, two aspects of the contingency. Selling my property and closing escrow. 1B is just simply selling my property. So the default time frame is after acceptance, the buyer has 17 days to enter into a contract for the sale of their property. You can change that if you want, or somebody may change that when they're submitting an offer. And then by the earlier of the time specified in 2A, which in this case is 17 days, or within 2 days after buyer entering into contract for the sale of the buyer's property, the buyer shall deliver escrow evidence to seller and escrow holder. So I've entered into a contract today that was accepted today. The buyer has 17 days to sell the property, to enter into a contract for the sale of the property. Today is what, the 30th, I think? So they have through October 17th to provide evidence that they sold the property by October 17th. Or and if they have, they need to provide evidence that they have entered escrow. Or if they sold the property, say October 5th, within 2 days of entering into escrow, they're required to provide me with evidence that they have sold the property. So if they sold it October 5th, within 2 days, it would be October 7th. I'm required as a buyer's agent to provide evidence that I have sold the property. If by the 17th, I have sold the property, I have 17 days, I'm required to provide evidence that I have sold the property. If after 17 days, I haven't sold the property, or the buyer's property is not sold, then it's possible that the seller has an opportunity to give a notice to perform to cancel the transaction.
So Rich, when you say sold, you mean enter into contract?
Enter into contract, yes. So I'm using sold loosely, as a matter of fact. We'll say it's just a shorter version.
Versus
So
closed.
enter into contract, exactly. That's all we're referring to in section 2. So once again, you have 17 days, that's the default time frame for the buyer to enter into a contract to sell their property. If they do enter into a contract to sell the property before then, within 2 days after that, they have an obligation to notify the seller that they have done so. Any questions about that? Okay. Section 3, listing and MLS status of buyer's property. If 1A or 1B applies, 1A once again, and I'm sorry to keep referring to this, it's both for entering into a contract for the sale of the property and closing escrow. 1B is simply entering into a contract for the sale of the buyer's property. So if 1A or 1B applies, it's stating the buyer has signed a listing agreement for buyer's property with Coldwell Banker Platinum Properties. So in this case, I haven't checked the box. So let's assume that a buyer submits an offer to you and they have not actually listed the property. Well, we would check the box, or really, realistically, the person making the offer should check the box. And then they're stating within 3 days after acceptance, I will have listed the property. So the offer is going to be predicated upon 2 things. They have actually listed the property. If they check the box, then they're saying within 3 days after acceptance on the property defined as 12 Longview, I will list the property. And then section 3B, buyer's property is or will be submitted to the MLS in the geographical area where buyer's property is located. That's the default response. If someone were to check the box and say buyer's property will not be submitted to the MLS in the geographical area where the buyer's property is located, that would be very questionable to me. Perhaps it's an off-market sale, and perhaps maybe they've got a buyer, but I would find that very questionable. And then under section 3C, buyer shall deliver to seller evidence of both the listing agreement and, if applicable, the MLS listing with the 1 day after acceptance if buyer's property is already listed with a real estate brokerage, or if not already listed within 1 day after listing with a real estate brokerage. So I've accepted the offer today. By tomorrow, the buyer must provide me with a copy of the listing agreement and a copy of the MLS printout indicating that it's on the MLS. So if they're claiming it's listed with 1 day after acceptance, they must provide evidence of the listing contract. It doesn't mean you can't redact information such as commissions and things like that. And then also a copy of the MLS printout. However, if they submitted an offer and it's not listed, they actually have 4 days to provide that information. They have 3 days after acceptance to list it, and 1 day thereafter to provide us with a copy of the listing agreement and evidence that it is on the MLS. So if it's listed, they have 1 day after acceptance to provide that information, listing contract and evidence from the MLS. If it's not listed after acceptance, they have 3 days to list the property and 1 day thereafter to provide proof that it's on the MLS and also a copy of the listing agreement.
What about the people that don't listing and then they put it on Zillow?
If they put it on Zillow?
Yeah, and they don't list it on the MLS.
Well, I would say they should be checking the box in the preceding paragraph saying they're not putting on the MLS. I would find that very questionable. Not only that, but if somebody's putting on the MLS in regards to the sale of the property and it's not on the MLS, it's a violation of the clear cooperation policy. If they're a member of the MLS, they have an obligation, once marketing a property within 1 day, to place that property on the MLS. So if they're not, it's a violation of the clear cooperation policy. Well, I'm going to tell you this. In my opinion, yes, it applies to leases, because if you look at the MLS rules and regulations, a sale is also defined to include lease property. However, the MLS is not enforcing that guideline. So I've already spoken to their general counsel about that, going back to last year, and they have not changed the MLS rules and regulations. They didn't realize that that's an aspect in which they're not enforcing. And not only that, they said they're not finding the MLS to enforce that aspect. So leases don't seem to be enforced. When you get a listing contract and a lease, this is a risk you're going to take because you know they can always change their minds. They're always looking for money. If you take a listing and you put it on Zillow, it's not on the MLS, they are not enforcing the clear cooperation policy associated with leasing activity. That maybe they change their minds tomorrow and then they start fining you. So that's a very good question. It's actually very frustrating from my perspective. Everything should be on the MLS and following the clear cooperation policy. Everybody understand what the clear cooperation policy is? If there's one person that doesn't, let me know and I will tell you.
Sure.
All right, thank you. So within one day, thank you, Carlos. Within one day of marketing your property, that means sending out a flyer, putting out a sign, putting something on Facebook, you have an obligation to post that property on the MLS. One day of marketing their property. Marketing is it excludes, let's assume you have a client and they have signed a disclosure regarding agency relationship. You can present that to them. That's not considered public marketing. But you put a sign up, any other form of advertising to the general public, that's deemed to be marketing. You have an obligation to post it on the MLS. Got a property right by my house, as a matter of fact. It's listed as coming soon, and I'm going to report them because it's not on the MLS. You didn't realize they're living or this property is directly next to a broker. A shitty sign, and they also have this crappy flyer. And if you're listing a property as coming soon, that's still an active type of listing, right? With a coming soon listing, you must also specify the date that it is coming soon too. And they didn't do that too. So when I have the time, I'm gonna report them.
You know.
I'm not mean. I expect everybody to follow the guidelines. They're trying to take advantage of the situation. That's my opinion. Yes. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Just follow the guidelines. It's pretty simple. All right. Section 4, close of escrow of buyer's property. If 1A or 1C applies, 1A, what is it? Once again, anybody want to repeat that for me? And 1C?
Entering into a contract, close of escrow.
Wow, fantastic. What's 1C?
You're in escrow.
Just right. Close of escrow. It's just the contingency is based on the close of escrow for the buyer's property. Very good. Glad to hear that. So if 1A or 1C applies, buyer has until the following time to close escrow on the sale of buyer's property. And that is going to be the scheduled close of escrow seller's property, or if checked no later than 5 days prior to the scheduled close of seller's property. Once buyer's property closes, buyer can no longer use this contingency to cancel the agreement. So let's just go through the details of this. Buyer has until the following time to close escrow on the sale of buyer's property, which is a scheduled close of escrow of seller's property. So I made an offer and I said, Mr. Seller, I'm going to close escrow on your property by October 31st. That is the time frame we're referring to. We're not talking about the time frame of the scheduled close of escrow of the buyer's property. Now, does that make sense? We think, all right, we want to, the buyer saying he wants to close escrow on October 31st on the property I'm selling. I would prefer actually that they close escrow no later than 5 days before the scheduled close of escrow of the seller's property. So if the scheduled close of escrow is October 31st, it's not very likely they're going to be able to close the sale of their property and also complete the transaction associated with the property they're trying to acquire. So from my perspective, if I'm a listing agent and someone doesn't check the box that I have right here, then I probably would give consideration to countering that. I would want them to close a couple of days in advance of the scheduled close of escrow of the property that I have listed. Otherwise, it just may not happen as agreed.
Still hard to close them both on the same day.
It's very difficult, right, for a double escrow to occur in the same day because the money has to be wired. If it's the same escrow, it's a little bit easier. If it's separate escrow, then the money has to be wired to the separate escrow and they have to disperse funds, and it just very well may not happen. So realistically, the close of escrow of the buyer's property should be happening by the scheduled close of escrow of the seller's property. That's the way this form is designed. And then any questions about that? Yeah. Status of sale of buyer's property, if 1A or 1C applies. So this is something that Sonny brought up, because what if there's changes that have taken place? Buyer agrees to keep seller informed about the status of the transaction for the sale of the buyer's property, including any changes, modifications, addenda or amendments to the terms of the accepted offer, or delays to or removal of contingencies. So the contract indicates, or this addendum indicates, that if there's a change in regards to the closing date or anything else that transpires, that's going to modify the terms of the original information that was provided to the seller, the buyer has an obligation to provide that to the seller. So if the close of escrow is going to be extended, they have an obligation to notify the seller. And then subsection 5B, within 2 days after seller's written request, but no earlier than the applicable time to remove contingencies in the contract for sale of buyer's property, buyer shall deliver to seller evidence of removal of those identified contingencies. So what is the time frame of those removal of those contingencies? Goes back to section 2A, 17 days. Any questions about that? All right, we'll continue on. Section 6, cancellation of buyer's property. If buyer's property is in or enters escrow, and either party to that escrow gives the other a notice of cancellation of contract, the buyer has 2 days thereafter, or within 2 days thereafter, shall deliver to seller written notice of that cancellation. So I'm the buyer, and I have found out that the person that's attempting to buy my property is canceling. I have an obligation to notify the seller of the property that I'm attempting to acquire that my transaction is canceling. And that also opens up an opportunity for the seller of the downleg property to cancel the transaction. And then backup offers and seller right to require buyer to remove contingencies or cancel. Backup offers, upon acceptance, seller shall have the right to continue to offer seller's property for sale for backup offers. The parties acknowledge that brokers shall not violate MLS rules requiring accurate property status reporting. So I've accepted a contingent offer. What status am I required to report on the MLS? Active under contract, correct. That is correct. You can't just leave it active. If you do, then you're in violation. If I'm listing agent and I leave it under active, I'm probably going to find that I'm going to have a violation reported against me by the agent representing the buyer. So just because it's a contingent sale doesn't change your obligation to change the status on the MLS to active under contract. Absolutely. You can do that, right? And that's exactly what we're trying to do. We want to solicit backup offers. It's just very difficult to obtain backup offers once the status has changed to active under contract. That's the dilemma. So sellers will say, can't we just continue to leave it actively marketed? No, we can't.
We change the property description. Actively accept backup.
I would say in the syndicated remarks you can. However, I would say you could not do that in the public remarks. I think that that's going to be a violation. So when you have a listing, there's two different aspects of public remarks, right? And there are a lot of restrictions in regards to what you can post. Syndicated remarks don't always show up everywhere. You can actually enter information like that. As a matter of fact, public remarks, you can't specify you're the listing agent or give your contact information. But in the syndicated remarks, you can say, hey, this is Richard Moore. I'm the best listing agent ever. Call me directly if you want to buy this property. So you can do that and without being a violation. So we know about backup offers now. Under section 7B, removal of buyer contingencies and proof of funds. Unless, and we'll go through this, paragraph 7C3 is selected. If seller accepts a written backup offer and provides buyer a copy of the signed accepted backup offer within the time frame specified in 7C1, and it says or 2, it should be referencing 7C2, seller shall have the right to give written notice to buyer to, in writing, remove this contingency, remove the loan contingency, if any, and provide verification of sufficient funds to close escrow without the sale of buyer's property. Seller may use the bottom of page 2 of this form to comply with the written notice requirements of this paragraph. If buyer fails to complete these actions within 2 days after delivery of such notice, seller may then immediately cancel the agreement in writing. So let's just go through this. So it's saying right now, the property is shown as active under contract in the MLS. I receive a backup offer. And let's assume under section 7C that I have not checked the boxes under 7C2. I haven't checked that, or I haven't checked the box under 7C3. So now I received a backup offer as a listing agent. I can actually give the buyer notice that I received this backup offer and give them 2 days to remove the contingency for the sale of their property. And if it's filled out in a manner which you're seeing right now under section 7C, that means I can give immediate notification, hey, Mr. Buyer, you must remove your contingencies. In addition to that, not just your contingency for the sale of your property, but you must also remove your loan contingency. In addition to that, you must provide me proof that you have sufficient funds to close this transaction. And if you don't do that, I can cancel the transaction. In the event section 7C2 is checked, and let's assume I accepted a contract or an offer today. So the 17-day period expires on October 17th, but on October 5th, I receive a backup offer. Well, I cannot, under that scenario, I cannot force the buyer to remove the contingency for the sale of their home. I can't do so until at least the 17th day. So it sits on the market for that period of time. And that may not be bad. If I'm a buyer, I probably would want at least that. Or maybe I would say in most cases, when I see this form, usually the buyer is looking for the contingency to extend through the close of escrow of the property I'm attempting to acquire.
Richard,
Yes.
coming back to the back offers, as a point of listing agent, how many back offers are you able? Is that limited to receive?
No, there's no limitation, but you would number them. You would just use the backup offer addendum and number them sequentially.
Now, if you are the buyer agent, you submit a back offer, are you able to send offers to another property?
Yeah, there's nothing that's preventing you from submitting multiple offers on multiple properties. And that was really prominent during the time when there were a lot of short sales, as a matter of fact. And that was unfortunate for sellers because buyers would cancel on some of the offers. They just took whichever one was most favorable for them. So there's nothing preventing you. Obviously, if you're submitting multiple offers on multiple properties, I would not disclose that to the listing agent. They're not going to look at you as being serious anyways. And then you better have a valid reason for canceling. And I would think in most cases, you could probably find a valid reason for cancellation, right? Property condition, things like that. So remember, once you send under this paragraph 7B, not only must the buyer remove the contingency for the sale of their property, they must also remove the loan contingency and provide proof that they have sufficient funds to close the transaction. Any questions about that? Section 8, removal of contingencies. This contingency can only be removed in writing, talking about the COP. Even if buyer removes this contingency, unless buyer also performs all actions pursuant to 7B, seller retains the right to cancel under paragraph 9. So what it's saying is, not only must the buyer remove the contingency for the sale of their property, they must also remove the loan contingency. and they must also provide evidence that they have sufficient funds to close. Otherwise, the seller can cancel the transaction. So how you manage that, I would say each and every transaction is going to be unique. Any questions about that? Okay. Whoever said this was easy, right? I think as from a listing agent standpoint, you just need to be aware of this. So we're enforcing the terms. You need to be sure that you're getting the contract for sale of the buyer's property. You need to be following up on the contingency periods. Because if something goes wrong, your seller's going to look at you and say, why didn't you do this? I think it's very critical in regards to assure ourselves of not having any type of issues with our sellers, especially as a listing agent. So now, rights for cancellation, seller right to cancel. The seller may cancel the agreement in writing as follows. The seller may cancel after first giving buyer a written notice to remove buyer contingencies and provide proof of funds if buyer fails to take all actions specified in 7B. So that means not only removing the contingency for the sale of the buyer's property, providing proof of funds, and also removing the loan contingency. If they don't do that, after the seller provides them evidence of a bona fide backup offer. Remember, if you're going to force the buyer's hands, you need to provide them the offer itself. That if the buyer doesn't remove the contingency for the sale of their property, if they also don't remove their loan contingency and don't provide proof of funds, the seller can cancel. So it's much more than just removing the contingency for the sale of the buyer's property. Next, the seller may cancel the agreement in writing as follows. Section B. After first giving buyer a notice to perform, if buyer fails to enter into the contract for the sale of buyer's property within the time specified in section or paragraph 2A. So if we checked 1A or 1B, we're saying we're going to sell this property and within section 2A, 17 days. If the buyer hasn't provided evidence that they have sold the property or at least entered into a contract for the sale of their property, the seller can cancel. Next, the seller may cancel the agreement this is section C, 9C, after first giving buyer a notice to perform if buyer fails to close escrow for the sale of buyer's property within the time specified in paragraph 4. And what is paragraph 4 referring to? It's referring to the close of escrow of the subject property, not their property. And then another reason for cancellation, section D, after first giving buyer notice to perform, if buyer fails to deliver escrow evidence within the time specified in paragraph 1C or 2B. And 1C is saying you must provide escrow evidence at the time you submitted the offer or within 2 days after acceptance. And let's go back here to make sure I'm not missing anything. And 2B is 17 days or within 17 days after acceptance if the buyer has not entered into a contract for the sale of their property. So another reason for the seller to cancel. Section 9E, another reason for the seller to cancel. If buyer fails to deliver evidence of the listing of buyer's property, or as applicable, the submission of buyer's property listing to the MLS with the time specified in paragraph 3C. So remember, once we have acceptance, we have 1 day, assuming the property is listed, we have 1 day after acceptance to provide evidence to provide the listing contract and a copy of the MLS printout showing it's on the MLS. If at the time of acceptance, the property is not listed, the buyer has 3 days to list their property and 1 day thereafter to provide a copy of the listing contract and evidence that the property is listed on the MLS. And then section 9F, if buyer fails to deliver evidence of removal of contingencies in the sale of buyer's property as specified in paragraph 5B. So remember, the buyer has an obligation within 2 days to notify the seller of any changes in the contract. And because you as a listing agent have a copy of the purchase contract for the sale of the buyer's property, you should know when the contingency periods expire. So you should also be asking for evidence of contingency removal. And if contingencies aren't being removed, well, the seller has an option. Do I continue working with this buyer? Or do I cancel the contract? Then another reason for the seller to cancel, section 9G, that the buyer gives notice to seller of either party's cancellation. I'm not sure what's happening here, Carlos. So if the buyer or the buyer's, the person attempting to buy the buyer's property gives notice of cancellation. So that's another reason for the seller to cancel. Buyer's right to cancel. Buyer may cancel the agreement in writing if prior to buyer's removal of the buyer's property contingency specified in paragraphs 1A, 1B, or C is applicable. If 1A or 1B applies, buyers are unable to enter into a contract on buyer's property within the time specified, paragraph 2A, and paragraph 2A is 17 days. If I can't sell my property within 17 days or enter into a contract for selling my property, thereafter I can cancel. Section 10B, if 1A or 1C applies, either party for buyer's property gives notice to the other to cancel the contract to purchase for buyer's property. So if it's in escrow, remember 1A refers not only to the entering into a contract for the sale of the buyer's property, but the close of escrow. 1C is simply for the close of escrow of the buyer's property. So if either the buyer or the person attempting to purchase a buyer's property gives notice of cancellation, the seller can cancel also. And then 1A or 1C, buyers unable to close escrow on buyer's property within the time specified in paragraph 4. Now, what is the time specified in paragraph 4? It's the close of escrow of the subject property. Is everybody awake here?
Richard? Can I ask a question?
Of course you can.
Okay, this type of contingency on selling the buyer's house first before entering to final transaction to buy another property, I heard last few years that contingency has gone away and no one is doing that.
No, I'm seeing it more now than I ever have, as a matter of fact.
It just started again.
Well, I would say sellers are they're more likely to give consideration to accepting a contingent offer.
Because the market has changed.
Correct.
That's what I'm saying,
Correct.
right? Before last few
No
years.
seller would accept a contingent offer, but now there's a lot more consideration being given to that contingent offer. So I myself have recommended to listing agents in certain cases when going through it, that they accept that contingent offer.
Accepted.
Yes. So I think that it's going to require the listing agent for the subject property to be sure that the buyer's property is listed at an appropriate price, things of that nature, right? We want to make sure that they're actually serious about this before we tie up that property. And for the most part, most of the contingent offers, the contingency extends to the close of escrow of the subject property. Most buyers are not willing to say that after 17 days of acceptance, that the seller can cancel, for example.
Yeah, this was common years and years.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? But
That's-
it seems like last so many years it went away and now it's coming back, which is a good thing.
Yeah, I think it's something we'll have to give consideration to.
It provides more transaction and easier.
We don't have much choice now, right? There are fewer buyers in the market who are serious. And then time frame, that's section 11, time for performance of contract obligations and delivery of buyer deposit. When do the time frames commence in this kind of a transaction? Anybody want to take a venture or a guess? It's right in front of us. That's correct. That's the default response. Very good, Shweta. So the questions become, all right, when did the time frame for contingencies, deposit of earnest money deposit occur? Well, the default response is it's no different in a traditional transaction. However, if we want to change that, for example, in section 11A, we would check the box and we would say, on the day after buyer delivers to seller any of the following: escrow evidence for buyer's property, buyer's election in writing signed by buyer to begin time periods, buyer's removal of this contingency for the sale of buyer's property. So if this box is not checked, if acceptance is today, the buyer has 3 business days to deposit their earnest money deposit. And they have the traditional timeframes for contingencies, unless it was modified, which would be 17 days. However, when they check this box, timeframes don't begin until one of these following aspects takes place. Buyer shows that they've actually sold their property, for example. And I think that's very important. And then the buyer's deposit, we talked about this just momentarily ago, right? But right now, the buyer has an obligation to deliver the deposit as they normally would in a traditional transaction, unless we check this box. And if we check the box, they don't have to deliver their deposit until 3 days after providing evidence to the seller they have entered into a contract for the sale of their property. Any questions about that? I know there are questions. What was that? It's bubbling, yes. So maybe you can understand why I had to read through this a few times, so I had a better grasp on this, as a matter of fact. Now, quickly, I'll do this as quickly as I can, but I did want to go through the request for repairs. Now, what we see often, and this is always, there's no 100% assurance, but when there's a request for repair, sometimes people will not only repairs, but then they'll ask for a credit. Now, remember, if there's going to be a credit, you're going to be submitting that document to escrow. And escrow is going to use that as the underlying document to issue an escrow amendment, say for a credit. It's $5,000, as a matter of fact, right? And what takes place, if there's a lender involved, those documents are going to be sent to the lender. And on that request for repairs, if you're asking for both repairs and a credit, the lender can make an arbitrary decision to state that I want all of those repairs completed. So let's assume we were submitting a request for repairs. There's a multitude of repairs that are required. Sunny had one recently, and there was mold. And so what took place, they're just going to, the seller agreed to just issue a credit, but not complete the mold remediation. So the lender then made a decision based upon seeing something in the request for repairs that that's great. We'll accept the credit that the seller is issuing in favor of the buyer, but we want the mold issues to be corrected. So you need to be very careful about what's on that request for repairs, especially if there's repairs that are not going to be completed. That's the issue. If the repairs are going to complete it, it's never an issue.
I have a question.
What type of repair?
Go ahead.
My question for you, let's say if I'm presenting the buyer, okay, we want to close on time. We don't want a lender to give us a default time to, fix all the list repair requests before we close the escrow. So if that will be an issue, we don't want to show the RRRR to the lender. So as my buyer, most of the buyer, they just want to get a credit. So they don't care. They want to just close the escrow and then they want to credit money. But if that was saying, maybe as a buyer agent, we just don't do RRRR, just negotiate with the listing agent verbally. And then we just say, hey, let's do addendum saying the seller going to credit, let's say $1,000 for the closing cost. So there's no RRRR, so we don't need to show the lender and the lender won't ask for that. So do you think that would be a good idea to just avoid RRRR?
Well, I do actually, or you may use this as a document to lead up to that. But if the request for repairs or the seller response to the request for repairs is never completed, you have a discussion with the other agent and say, hey, look, this could cause issues with the lender. So we're just going to issue a separate addendum indicating that there's going to be a credit against closing costs and leave it at that.
Okay, I already know the answer, but I still want to ask you this because I think probably other agents, they don't know. What about if the credit, so cannot there's more money left. That's just saying, okay, closing, let's say I credit like a $10,000 for closing costs, but maybe only closing costs only cost for $7,000. There's still $3,000 left. What are you gonna do? Is that like escrow can just give a buyer a check for $3,000, or how could you handle this?
So just to clarify the question, I think it's clear, but we negotiated a credit and there's a lender involved. If there's never a lender involved, then it's not an issue. But if the credit exceeds the allowable lender credits, because maybe you as the agent, you could be issuing credits. So what takes place for any unused closing cost credits? Anybody want to respond to that? I know you know the answer to that. What was that?
They don't get it.
Well, yeah, they don't get it. They can lose that. So in Cindy's example, she said, I'm going to issue a credit, or we're going to get a credit of $10,000 and my closing costs are only $7,000. What happens to that $3,000 in unused credits? Well, based upon section 5 of the contract, the buyer is going to lose the benefit of that $3,000. So what you must do when you're negotiating closing costs, you must also stipulate or state that any unused credit will be used as a direct reduction in the purchase price of the contract, or the purchase price.
That's the only thing, because before I thought like, oh, the export just give a check to the buyer for $3,000. That won't work. So they have to like reduce the leasing price. Of course, this all issue relate to if you has a loan, if you're cash buyer, you don't have.
It doesn't matter. Yeah.
For the most of my case, all the buyers are cash. I never really experienced with a lender. So now when you deal with a lender, there's a lot of problems and you really have to think about like ahead of time.
Correct.
What's the maximum credit or percentage that a lender would allow?
Usually up to 6%, depending upon the loan to value, 6% of the purchase price. But the higher the loan to value, the lower the threshold will be.
So it cannot be more than 6% the purchase price.
Correct. No more, but most likely going to be less. So if I'm getting a 50% loan to value, they're going to allow me up to 6% of the purchase price for closing costs. If I'm putting only 10% down, they're going to limit how much the closing cost credits I can benefit from.
But is that same as if like for example, if I'm a buyer agent, I don't want to credit my commission to the buyer. So if there's, how can we do that? Like,
Well, it's no different. It's the total credits favoring the buyer. That's right. So it doesn't matter if it's the seller or any of the other parties. That percentage is going to be limited. Correct.
like
Correct.
credit for six, cannot be
The
more than-
total credits, not just from one entity or one source.
Buyers, recurring and non-recurring closing costs, so that, you know, with that intention in mind of any leftover money to use to buy down the rate.
You could do that, right? You know, and no longer do we seem to have to specify a recurring and non-recurring. Before, it seems like we did, but now the contract has been modified. It's just, you know, you look at section 3, it talks about just closing costs, and closing costs, first of all, include prepaid interest. If you're having impounds, any of those non-recurring closing costs also, but interest could, for example, would be something that a closing cost credit can cover. But, and now, hopefully I answered your question in that regard.
Oh. To buy down the rate.
You can buy the rate down. If you find in our example that there's a credit of $10,000 and there's only $7,000 in total closing costs, then you better find something. You know, the one thing you can say is they can pay me as the agent more commission. They'll object to that, right? But that's an example of what you could do, right? You could, right. Or you could buy the rate down, things like that. Just remember, anytime there's a credit, be sure the lender's notified as soon as possible.
It's a credit to picture.
You can, you can prepay HOA dues. As a matter of fact, I don't see any reason you can't. Now, property taxes have come up. Can I prepay property taxes? Typically, the lender is going to want to see a property tax bill, so there may not be something that you can prepay, because most likely the assessor is going to issue a refund, and the lender doesn't want you getting any money or cash back. But if you have impounds, it could be as much as 8 months of insurance and property taxes. So that's something that could benefit somebody if they have unused credits.
When you say HOA dues, is that because HOA dues normally monthly, probably like 300, 500? You mean like pay HOA dues? Is that means that you can pay a couple of months ahead of time?
You might be able to prepay a year.
But I think like it won't be that much. Monthly is all.
Yeah,
Is
yeah.
there a case that it can be over the amount, let's say 6% over the price? But let's say it goes 10%, let's say $500,000 to property, and it's a flip, say something, and they need to put 50,000 because the roof or any big damage, that can cancel, do the cancellation of the property if you are at the estimated.
If,
Because the bank is not gonna, you have to give it to the bank who's gonna give the loan. They can lose the loan because of the big property, the big fix,
I mean, the credits or the repairs are,
and the repairs.
if they're not done before the close of escrow?
If they say I found the repairs and the guy came in and say, okay, you could put 50,000 because
Uh-huh.
the structure is such.
If the appraiser, for example, calls out deficiencies in the property?
Yeah.
Yeah, then the lender's not gonna close unless those repairs are completed.
Oh.
And then that's another thing, I would never suggest, even though this form talks about under section 2 attached reports, I would always avoid referencing specific reports in this form, because if this goes to the lender may then ask for those reports. Now, the likelihood's low, but if they ask for those reports and they see deficiencies in the property, they may make an arbitrary decision that certain deficiencies must be corrected. So if you don't mention reports in the purchase contract, unless it's an FHA or VA loan, they're not going to be asking for anything.
That's a really good point. If I'm presenting about this, I shouldn't check with Mark.
I wouldn't do that. I would not attach or reference any reports in the request for repairs.
You would estimate, they would change the whole thing.
Inspection.
Not here, I would do it elsewhere. You know, what's your obligation? If you're representing the buyer, you have an obligation. That obligation survives termination of the contract to provide any reports that you've obtained. I wouldn't probably put it in here. I would just send them separately. I don't want the lender, if the lender's ever going to see this request for repairs, to see any of the reports that I've obtained. Because then that opens up, if they see this as an underlying document to an escrow amendment, if there's a credit, if there's no credit, it doesn't matter. But if they see that, that opens up their ability to say, you know, I want to see that report. Now, that may be a little bit too conservative, but why would we want to put ourselves in that position, as a matter of fact?
That's a really good point. We shouldn't put like.
Same thing with the purchase contract. I see people writing in that the buyer's going to pay for their own physical inspection. You don't have to write that in there. Why would you even do that? Then that opens up the ability for a lender to say, oh, I want to see that physical inspection. Just don't do it. Same thing with the termite report. Usually it's customary that we ask for a termite report in the purchase contract. If there's a termite report, there's at least a 50-50 chance that the lender, if there's a lender, is going to want to see a completion of that termite work, or the remediation of that termite work. Because at certain times, you may not, the buyer may decide, okay, I'd rather just get a credit. If that's the case, you can also just issue an addendum to the purchase contract saying, strike and delete the termite report. You can do something like that too.
For the termite, we can just, RPA just saying, make another addendum. saying
You can, exactly. Exactly.
Termite, by seller gonna pay the termite clearance over there.
Yes, yeah.
But we don't ever attach the termite reports to that, right?
I'm sorry, what was that, Ann?
I don't think we attach any of the termite reports.
No, but in the request for repairs,
Okay.
it's usually, well, usually in the purchase contract, many times we will ask for the seller to provide a termite report, which is very customary.
Yeah,
So just be prepared that the work should be complete. If sometimes it's negotiated or that the seller's not going to complete the termite work. If the seller's not going to complete the termite work and there's a loan involved, the lender may not allow the transaction to close without a completion or remediation of the work that's called out in the termite report. So if that's the case, just delete the termite report through an addendum.
right, okay.
You can do that.
Okay.
But then one other thing I wanted to mention specifically about this, when you remove it, let's assume I submit a request for repairs and the seller just agrees to it without making any changes, or in the event there are even changes through the seller response to the buyer request, which is form RRRR. If the parties agree, the entire investigation contingency is removed, whether or not you attach a contingency removal form. So that's pretty substantial in regards to your negotiations. And I just wanted to mention what those things were. So if you come to an agreement in regards to the request for repairs or the seller response to the buyer's request for repairs, that removes the buyer investigations, which include a general home inspection, lead-based paint inspection, termite inspection, for example, and any other specific physical inspections of the property. So keep that in mind when you do agree or you come to a conclusion in regards to form RR or RRRR. And I'm not laughing. So that's the end of today's discussion. Anybody have any questions about that?
We were just saying, actually, like, oh, once we haven't sent an inspection contingency removal to the seller. But we have agreed, they agreed to our request for repairs, so then they automatically instrument.
It does, right? And you may not recognize that if everybody agrees to the request for repairs, that entire investigation contingency is removed. Now, that does not include review of the seller's disclosures, but still, that's huge. It could be neighborhood noise, location, things like that. HOA docs are called out separately, so no, that would not be included in regards to the physical investigation on the property. Okay, all right, well, thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming today.
Want to do the drawing?
Oh, yeah, sure. Everybody turn their cards in.